Good afternoon. My name is James Preston Allen. I'm the publisher of Random Links News, and we are here in the media center of the Random Links News, close to the heart or the doorstep of the global trade economy at the Port of Los Angeles. And I am here today to interview Thomas Carl Hartmann, who you may recognize as being a Progressive America's favorite radio host on the local KPFK channel, 5 days a week, 90.7 on your radio dial. But what many of you may not know is that Tom is also the author of about a couple dozen books. And his latest one is called The Hidden History of Monopolies: How Big Business Destroyed the American Dream. It looks a little bit like this. And it will be, or is now available at all the finer radical bookstores across America. Good afternoon, Tom. How are things up in Oregon?
Hey, James, it's great to see you again.
Yeah.
Yeah, the smoke has cleared out here, so things are better. I can breathe.
Yeah, the smoke is cleared, and have the federales left?
I don't know. I think I think they stopped doing their thing about a month ago, or a couple of weeks ago, anyway.
Yeah, it had the entire nation riveted with the conflict there in front of the courthouse. But let's talk about your new book. I found it kind of curious that you would come out with a book on monopolies. And I think most people don't really think much about monopolies these days, although perhaps they should. But in the beginning of the book, you talk about the founding fathers and their concern about a particular monopoly. Tell us about that.
Yeah, you're talking about the British East India Company.
Yes.
Yeah. The East India Company, capitalism is really only, arguably 400 years old, and its modern form not even really 300 years old. And the first modern corporation was chartered in December of 1601 by Queen Elizabeth I, and it was called the British East India Company. Most of the stock was owned by the royal family and members of parliament. And it became the world's largest corporation and operated as the world's largest monopoly in the 1700s, which is where our story begins. And in 1770, at that point in time, the two most popular drugs being consumed in the North American colonies were alcohol, although that was mostly in bars at night and pretty much restricted to men, and caffeine. And that was principally taken in the form of tea, and tea shops were ubiquitous in the colonies. They were community centers. They were attached to all different kinds of businesses. There was a tea shop literally on every block in colonial America, in the cities anyway. And about half of those tea shops were buying their tea the legal way. They were buying it through the East India Company, which had been granted a monopoly on the tea trade in North America by the British government. And about the other half of them were getting kind of a little rebellious, and they were buying their tea from smugglers, mostly American smugglers, but there were some British and Spanish smugglers. And the prices were more or less the same. The smugglers sometimes had a slight price advantage, but it was more almost a political statement who you got your tea from. So anyhow, what happened in 1770 was that there was a worldwide, or a Anglo world anyway, in North America and the United Kingdom, depression. It started out as a recession in the late 1760s, and by 1770, it was a full-blown depression. And the East India Company was freaked out. They were running out of cash. They didn't know what to do. They were very, very concerned. They were to dial back some of their activities around the world. And this was the principal instrument of empire for the British Empire. And so when the East India Company came to the British Parliament in 1772 and said, we desperately need help, they said, okay, no problem. And so what they did, and it was formalized in 1773, in the Tea Act of 1773, was they said that the tax that the East India Company had paid on tea in inventory, back at that time, you didn't pay like a sales tax. You didn't pay tax on something when you sold it. You paid tax on it when you received it. It was essentially an inventory tax. So as 1 million pounds of tea came from India up into the United Kingdom, the British East India Company paid taxes on that, and that sat in their warehouses until they could sell it. So the British government said, we're not only not going to charge you taxes going forward on tea, or reduce the level of tax dramatically, but we're going to give you a refund on all that tax you've already paid for the millions of pounds of tea that you have in inventory. A multi-million dollar in today's dollars, maybe a multi-$100 million refund. And so the East India Company was able then to do two things. Number one, because their tea no longer was taxed, they were able to undercut the smugglers.
Bootleggers, yeah.
And number two, because they had all this cash from the rebate on the taxes, they were actually able to basically pull a Walmart. Go into these towns and say, not only will we sell you tea cheaper than the smugglers, but we'll subsidize it. We'll knock another 20% off the top, and we'll eat that, or whatever the percentage was. And this infuriated the colonists. I mean, who likes to have a Walmart pulled on you, right? For every Walmart that opens in rural America, the small towns around typically lose about 110 businesses. And that's what was threatening to happen. So the colonists rose up, and one nice November night in 1773, a bunch of them marched out to Griffin's Wharf and boarded 3 of these British ships and threw, I think it was 348 chests of tea into the ocean, or into the harbor, and which was worth in today's dollars $1 million. It was a $1 million act of vandalism. The British responded with the Boston Ports Act this was in November 73, so this was the Ports Act was spring of 74, which said that if Boston didn't repay the company the $1 million for the tea, that they were going to blockade the Boston Harbor. The good citizens of Boston said, okay, screw you, bring it on. That led to the Boston Massacre, and indirectly to the shots heard around the world, and the Declaration of Independence 2 years later in 1776, on July 4th. So our revolution was fought against monopoly, explicitly, openly, understood by every one of the founders and framers. And that story has been lost in American history. Most people think that it was taxation without representation, meaning that somehow the taxes went up in 1773 with the Tea Act of 1770. No, the taxes went down. This was a giant corporate tax cut, and that's what triggered the American Revolution in large part.
So in the formative years of this country, we had 2 parties. One was the Democratic Republicans, and then you had the Federalists. And the Federalists were the conservative party, basically, right?
That's correct.
Does it strike you as somewhat odd that what we are now approaching in this election is a merger of the Democrats and moderate Republicans supporting Biden against what might be considered the libertarian Republicans that are supporting Trump? And is there some sort of echo from the early years of the Republic in this?
I don't think so. What I'm seeing, the Republicans that I'm seeing who are saying they're going to vote for Joe Biden, I guarantee you the day after Joe Biden is sworn into office, assuming God willing he wins, they will begin mercilessly harassing him and every other Democrat and going back to their issues of balanced budgets and tax cuts for billionaires and all the other stuff. I think what is going on right now is that these folks are looking at Donald Trump and Steve Bannon and Bill Barr and realizing deep down inside, absolutely crystal clear, that these people are not Republicans. They're not even really invested in the history of America. They are fascists. And fascism represents such a real and existential threat to the normal functioning of American government, and ultimately, to American society and even to American business, that they're willing to support a Democrat. Frankly, I think they'd be supporting Bernie Sanders if he was the nominee, simply because they're so afraid that the United States is going to go down the road that Hungary's gone down, that Poland's going down, that Russia went down.
Right.
Right. In the 30s, we saw, in Europe and Japan, and they just don't want that to happen.
And isn't there a connection between monopolies or the growing of monopolistic power in a nation's economy and a tendency towards more autocracy or in some cases fascism?
Yeah, where when you talk about the concentration of political power, we call that oligarchy or fascism or tyranny. In fact, my next book, which will be out in a couple of months, maybe 5 months, I think, or 4 months, and is available for pre-order right now, is called The Hidden History of Oligarchy. And it's the story of basically the rise of fascism and neo-fascism in the United States, and how we can recognize it, what we can do about it. To some extent around Trump, but really in a much larger frame than that. So that book is dealing with the concentration of political power. This book, The Hidden History of Monopolies, deals with the concentration of economic power. Now, you can't separate the two. And in the Monopoly book, I refer to, the rise of neo-fascism and neoliberalism in the United States. And in the oligarchy book, I'm referring to the rise of monopoly in the United States, because they tend to feed each other. But as economic power becomes concentrated through the vehicle of monopoly, it tends to also concentrate political power, which leads us toward fascism.
Which is what the post-Civil War Congress attempted to do with the antitrust laws.
Right. I think, if we back up just a little bit, James, and do a kind of big picture concept riff here. First of all, keeping in mind that capitalism is a relatively recent thing. It's only a couple centuries old, at least in its modern form. That in your body and mine and all of our bodies every day, we have, billions of cells that are reproducing. And, occasionally a wild cell will reproduce in a way that causes it to become cancerous. We have an immune system that tracks these down and destroys them, but occasionally one will get past our immune system because our immune system has been compromised, or because it's just a particularly, voracious eater, as it were, a particularly virulent type of cancerous cell. And that cell will set up housekeeping in whatever organ it emerged from, the liver or the kidneys or the bone or whatever. And
are you making capitalism a form of cancer?
No, let me finish.
Okay.
So that cell will set up housekeeping and say, I am the most important cell in the whole body. I'm going to take all the energy and all the resources of the body and direct it into me, just me. And cancer cells actually, or cancer masses, tumors, actually have developed their own blood system, their own blood supply. I mean, they're literally sucking out the resources of the whole rest of the body. And it causes the rest of the body to dry up and blow away, like we saw Steve Jobs in the last weeks of his life as a result of his pancreatic cancer. And I would submit to you that a monopoly is the same thing to capitalism as cancer is to our bodies. That in a monopoly, an individual company or a small group of companies, typically working within a single sector, will say, I am the only one, I'm going to take everything. And like John Rockefeller in the 1890s controlling 90% of the oil trade in the United States, or Andrew Carnegie at that same time controlling 70 or 80% of all the steel trade, or the JP Morgan with the banks, or Dow and
Right.
with chemicals and explosives and et cetera. And so these monopolies, we figured out, it really wasn't an issue at the founding of the Republic. We fought a war against a giant monopoly, the East India Company. We rejected it. We got rid of it. And we were largely an agricultural country. So the closest we got really to monopolies in the United States in the first 100 years, or 70 years anyway, was the concentration of cotton growing in the South and some of the large plantations and the banks in New York. But in neither case were they, the kind of monopolies that can bring down a country or seize the entire economic power of a country.
Right, right.
That didn't happen until the 1870s, really, until after the Civil War and the 1880s. And at that point, in the 1880s, Ohio, which was where John Rockefeller was headquartered, people don't realize because the oil wells are all gone now because they sucked all the oil out of the ground. But Ohio and Pennsylvania were the epicenter of the oil industry in the United States in the late 1800s. There were oil wells everywhere. And Rockefeller ended up owning most of them. And so Ohio passed this antitrust law. And then inspired by that, a few years later in 1880, whatever it was, 7 or 8, Senator Sherman of Ohio proposed the what we refer to as the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was passed, I think, in 1890 by Congress. It really wasn't enforced until around 1906, which is an interesting story, 1905, that has to do
with Teddy Roosevelt,
yeah.
Right?
That was when it really started getting enforced. But the whole idea was, let's install an immune system into capitalism to deal with the potential cancer, the existing cancer at that time, of these monopolies. And so
in your mind, in terms of just the being able to talk about this, because I have this conversation frequently with conservatives. My argument has always been that there's the free enterprise system, which makes up Main Street economics in America. And then you have the capitalists, which are the banks and the big monopolies and whatnot. And the third leg of our economy, of course, is the government and the government spending on how it goes about doing its procurements. And that when you get any one of those three legs out of balance with the other, it causes distortions in the economic flow of capital through the system. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, it does. And I would say that as monopolies grow, they fall into that bucket that you're calling the capitalists. My definition is slightly different, but it's a good working metaphor, I suppose, and push out the ability of small businesses to start. I've started 7 small businesses in my life, and built up a couple of them to fairly substantial size, and sold them off, and retired and traveled the world, and then started another business. And a lot of what I did back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, starting these companies, you just couldn't do today, because the market niches are no longer available. We have wiped out small business in America because of monopolies in every sector of the American economy. Virtually every sector of the entire American economy is now controlled by typically 3 to 5 companies who control typically 70 to 85% of the total market share. And
you go through a list of those market segments, from pharmaceuticals to hospitals, media, okay, is a big one, explain just one of those.
Well, if I could just finish. As a result of that, as a result of this monopolization, the average American family is spending $5,000 a year more than does a similar middle-class family in any European or South Asian country. And because the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Taiwanese, the Europeans, they're all still enforcing their antitrust laws. So we pay 2 to 4 times more for broadband service than any other in the developed world than any other people in any other country. We pay more than twice as much for cell phone service. We pay anywhere from 3 to 7 times more for cable TV service. We pay substantially more, a little less than twice as much for airfare. We pay more, I mean, you know, pick your sector, right? We pay more for food. We pay more than twice as much, and in some cases as much as 10 times as much for medication. We pay more than twice as much for hospitalization. In every one of these sectors, you see this intense concentration or monopolization. And as a result, you and I, James, our families are on average spending an additional $5,000 a year, which basically means we're all poorer to the tune of $5,000 a year. And the billionaires in these giant corporations are $5,000 per American wealthier. That's part of that $50 trillion transfer of wealth we've seen in the United States from the bottom 90% to the top 5% that has happened since 1982, when Ronald Reagan stopped enforcing the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Clayton Act and the Antitrust Act of 1956. And
you spend a significant amount of time talking about, is it Robert Bork?
Yeah.
Who you are arguing is one of the architects of this Chicago School of Economics theory about this form of deregulation and non-enforcement of the antitrust laws as being good for the public because it keeps prices lower. And yet what you're arguing right now is that it's doing just the opposite.
That's correct.
Explain that.
Yeah. Prior to 82, when Reagan changed the rules of capitalism, we had this understanding, and this went back to the 1800s. We had this understanding that a corporation, a business, had multiple stakeholders, and they had a responsibility to each of these groups of stakeholders. There was the communities within which the corporation operated. They had a responsibility to treat them well. They had their workers. That's a stakeholder for a corporation. You literally can't make things without labor. So the workers are a big piece of it. They had their stockholders, of course, which is what Bork was pointing at. They have their customers, and they have the institution of the corporation itself. Back when Reagan came into office in 81, the average CEO in the United States had worked at the same company for more than 31 years. People started literally as mail clerks and worked their way up to CEO. That was the norm in the United States. And the average CEO made only 30 times what the lowest paid person in the company did. And part of that had to do with tax laws, but a lot of this had to do with how dynamic and competitive our industries were in the United States. And how much variety there was. You know, prior to Reagan, you could drive across the country and stop in little town after little town and know exactly where you are because, oh, there's the Biloxi Diner and there's the Biloxi Hotel and there's the Biloxi First National Bank. And now it's, oh, there's Wells Fargo and there's a Marriott and there's,
all of the towns have the same brand name for whatever it is you're looking for. And so it's almost like you never left Torrance.
That's right. So everything's
Wyoming.
Yeah. So everything's homogenized. I forgot where we started on this. Where I was going with that idea.
I talked there at one point in the book.
Bork. Let me tell you about Bork. Let me finish the thought.
Oh, okay. Yes, Bork.
So, we had this understanding that a corporation had these multiple stakeholders, and including the community, what Bork came along and said, he was a student of Milton Friedman's at the Chicago School of Economics. And what Bork said was, none of that matters. It doesn't matter what a corporation does to the local community. Doesn't matter. They could fight back on their own. Doesn't matter what they do to their workers. Their workers can choose to go work someplace else. There's no fan of unions, by the way. It doesn't matter what they do to their customers, because if they piss off their customers, they'll lose their customers. Kind of ignoring the fact that once you've got a monopoly, you don't have any place else you can go, right, as a customer. And the institution of the corporation itself is meaningless. In fact, if you're going to start breaking up corporations and stealing their pension funds and firing their people and deunionizing them and slamming, you know, dozens of corporations together into one giant corporation, that's all just fine, as long as the price to consumers doesn't go up. That's the only metric that matters. Now, this was a complete BS theory. It had never been demonstrated. There was literally no mathematical, scientific, or economic foundation for it at all. It was another one of Milton Friedman's crazy ass theories. But Bork turned it into a religion. He wrote a book about it. He testified before Congress dozens of times about this. He traveled the country being an evangelist for this. And he was, and then when he got put on the circuit court, you know, on the appeals courts, you know, he started even having rulings like this, which ultimately made their way to the Supreme Court, where in the GTE Sylvania case, and I think it was 74, it was somewhere in the 70s, the Supreme Court even started adopting pieces of this, not on a constitutional basis, but on a statutory basis.
Right.
So this theory that Bork had laid out is really, I mean, he borked America. I mean, he's the one who convinced Reagan and that whole, you know, neoliberal experiment that Reagan was in the middle of when Reagan and Bush were negotiating NAFTA and all these other things. All of that came out of Robert Bork, which is kind of bizarre, you know, because Reagan eventually tried to put him on the Supreme Court. And that's when we discovered that Robert Bork had written all these horrible things about gay people and black people. And you know, he was a racist and a misogynist and a bigot and proud of it.
On top of him being a follower of Ayn Rand and Milton Friedman, whose final act, you might say, of economic depravity or whatever was shown in the meltdown of the economic market in 2008.
Yep.
In which Alan Greenspan famously said that he never imagined that the market wouldn't self-correct.
Right. Yeah.
That to me was the ultimate. Oh my God!
This was the Alan Greenspan who brought a 6-foot-tall bouquet of roses that were in the shape of a dollar sign to Ayn Rand's funeral. This is the Alan Greenspan who was initiated into her cult in her apartment in New York City and may have had an affair with her. This was the Alan Greenspan who in 1997 told the Wall Street Journal that his job as chair of the Fed was to maintain, quote, a certain necessary minimum amount of worker insecurity, end quote. And that whenever workers started doing too well, he would raise interest rates and slow down the economy, which would throw enough people out of work that workers would get frightened and they wouldn't work to unionize. That
right, and part of that Milton Friedman economic model was that you had to maintain a certain level of unemployment.
That's right.
So that you could stem the tide of inflation. You could keep inflation at a moderate level because there was enough unemployment that kept price surges down.
That's sort of a super simplified version of it, but I wouldn't disagree with that.
Yeah.
Add to it. Yeah.
Let's go back to talking about monopolies.
Mm-hmm.
And at one point in your book, you talk about natural monopolies. And you don't use the term unnatural monopolies, but versus other types of monopolies.
Right.
For our listeners, define what a natural monopoly is.
Well, a natural monopoly is the place where government is most appropriately inserted. For example, you don't want to have 5 police departments in your town. You really just need one, and which is a monopoly, right? But it's a natural monopoly. I mean, it's the logical outcome of the way that we live in cities or towns or wherever it may be.
Oh, police departments, fire departments, a water company.
Well, those are at the level of society, schools, fire departments, police departments, those are natural monopolies at the level of community. At the level of the individual, here in this house where I'm talking to you from, I've got one pipe coming into this house with water. I got one pipe leaving this house with sewage, and I have one cable line coming into this house, and I've got one electric line coming into this house. Each one of those represents a natural monopoly. And that's why about half of all the electricity that's produced in the United States is produced by community-owned power companies, which are more reliable and have lower prices than for-profit private electric companies like PG&E. Why about half of a little more than half actually, of our septic in the United States and our water is handled that way as well. And why really until the late 90s, even things like, telephone service, well, that's we could set that aside for a minute, because
it was a government granted.
That's right. And it came out of the theory that there's only one set of wires coming into your house. So if there's going to be this natural monopoly of telephone service, and this is starting in the late 1800s, if there's going to be this natural monopoly of telephone service, then if it's not going to be run by the government, it has to be heavily regulated.
Right. And in Oregon, do you have a public utilities commission like we do in California?
Every state does. Yeah.
Every state does. Okay. So the other day when I was pondering what I was going to be asking you and thinking about natural monopolies, I asked my staff what they thought, what the commons were. And they initially all sort of scratched their heads. I was thinking that they would immediately think about the sidewalk in front of our business, the street that they drove on to get to work, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Fire department, police department. That's that at the level of community.
Right.
Stuff. That's the commons.
The first comment out of my bookkeeper's mouth was, well, I suppose language.
Oh, that's brilliant.
And I thought, wow, I mean, seeing as how we work at a newspaper, yeah, I mean, could you imagine if somebody decided that they were going to copyright the English language?
Right.
That would be an interesting one. But on the community level, I mean, here in San Pedro, we have the Port of Los Angeles, the Port of Long Beach, both of which are owned by the state and are allowed through contract to the municipalities to be run for the benefit of people of the state of California. Those are part of our commons.
Whereas you will find ports up and down across the Gulf Coast and up and down the East Coast that have been privatized.
Yes, yes.
No advantage to the communities, I'll add.
Right, right. And I mean, as much as we have this public control over our ports all the way up, probably along the West Coast, there is still an issue of them being transparent and them being responsive to the needs of the local public, as opposed to them being in the pockets of the large multinational corporations that do all of their import-export business here.
Right.
Yeah. Interesting. So what other parts of the commons is your book talking about?
I'd have to go back, and it's been over a year since I wrote the book, but I think that the commons is really kind of I mention the commons in the book, but I don't do that much. It's in one chapter. I don't do that much of a deep dive. I think beyond the conversation, largely.
Give our listeners then the basic concept of where the commons comes from. Yeah.
Well, if you look at human history, the 300,000 years of human history, and particularly the last 10,000 years of it, what you see is the steady contraction of the commons. That if you look at hunting gathering people, everything is the commons. There's virtually no private property. People live collectively. They share food, they share clothing, they basically share everything. more or less. And then as the agricultural revolution happened 8,000 years ago, some of us who chose to leave behind hunting gathering started fencing off our land and saying, okay, this is my land. This is no longer part of the commons and you can't come here. And, and then, it's been a steady progression since then to the commons shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. I mean, you got towns that used to be, Boston back in the 1770s probably had 4 times as much land, maybe 10 times as much land devoted.
Yeah, the Boston Commons.
Right, Boston Common. In fact, in the late 1600s, when Boston was just basically starting, was a common place to graze your sheep and goats.
Right. And the concept of the commons comes to us from English common law, where the peasants got to graze their sheep and cattle because the rest of the land was owned by the royalty, right?
I believe so. I'm not. I think that the way that feudalism got played out in different countries and during different times would provide a lot of nuance to that. Martin Bloch, B-L-O-C-H, wrote a brilliant book about the history of feudalism. I think I might reference it in this book. I know I reference it in one of my books.
You do. Yeah. In one of the later chapters, you talk about the sort of neo-feudalism, based upon the fact that the corporations now own so much of the American economy, that what we basically have is a new form of peasantry and a new form of, the barons of capital, basically.
That's correct. And a further shrinking of the commons. But, I wouldn't disagree with what you said. I would just say that there's a lot of nuance and a lot of grayscale in there over the centuries, going back to, the time of Christ, basically.
So since on your radio program, you almost inevitably each week go back and talk about Reaganism, Reaganomics.
That's when it all started to fall apart.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you next, and that is about the transmogrification of the Republican Party via Reagan, both Bushes, and now Trump.
Right.
There's a thread there. There is this steady decline of something. Explain that.
Yeah. The Republican Party and the conservative movement, for that matter, pre-64 was all in favor of the same goals and ideals as the Democratic Party, which was a strong labor force. Labor unions were okay. Eisenhower, in fact, in 1956, when he ran for re-election, campaigned on the fact that he had doubled the number of people getting Social Security, and he had nearly tripled the number of people who had union jobs. I mean, it was just a major thing, and you can go back and see the old Eisenhower ads. They just wanted to do it more slowly. My dad was an Eisenhower Republican. They were like, oh yeah, we need to do, fill in the blank, all these things. We need to strengthen labor. We need to reduce racial segregation and ultimately eliminate it. We need to educate our kids. We need, all these things. But basically, William F. Buckley famously said back in the 60s that a conservative is a man who stands astride the arc of history with his hand out shouting, stop, or at least slow down. And that was the idea. So what happened in '64 was Goldwater basically threw in with the racists, and the proto-libertarians. I mean, the libertarian movement had not really been created at that point. It came out of the FEE in the 70s, and out of this real estate lobbying group. And Ayn Rand's writings were largely unknown, but that was the early movement, and it didn't go anywhere. I mean, it was widely repudiated, and Goldwater suffered one of the worst electoral defeats in the history of America. But by the mid 70s, they had put this thing together, and the Republican Party officially flipped in 1980 when Ronald Reagan became their nominee. and ceased to be that Eisenhower party of, and even Nixon, by the way, was not that vigorously opposed to unions, although he was no fan of them, but he was perfectly willing to take a $500,000 bribe from Jimmy Hoffa.
Right.
But Reagan came along and said, no, the principal source of funding for the Democratic Party are the unions, and so we're going to destroy them. Just unambiguously. And the people who are funding the Republican Party are the giant corporations and the billionaires, and we are going to serve them. And in order to, but see, there's not enough billionaires and giant corporation CEOs to elect a president. So they had to broaden their coalition. So Reagan's first speech that he gave after he had been nominated in 1980 to be the Republican nominee for president, his first speech was in Philadelphia, Mississippi, or just outside town at the Nebosha, I think it's pronounced, County Fair, which is right down the road from where Schwermer, Goodman, and Cheney, the three civil rights workers, were murdered in 64, I think, whatever year it was, that they made the movie Mississippi Burning out of. And his entire speech was about states' rights. And in this election right now, see, this was the foundation point, right? 1980. Right. In the 2016 campaign, Don Jr. gave his first political speech in support of his father's candidacy at that same county fair in Mississippi. And he referenced the fact that this was Reagan's first speech. It was an all-white audience, about 10, 15,000 people. And he talked about states' rights just like Reagan did. In fact, he quoted Reagan. And we all know that that's code for, that basically the Republican Party is now officially the party of white people, and in particular, white men. And so that, but even that wasn't enough. I mean, Nixon with his Southern strategy and Reagan becoming much more explicit about it, bringing in the white racists, that was a good start, but they still needed a few more. And so, post 1973 Roe v. Wade, they tried to bring in the Catholics, and then by 1980, 81, 82, the fundamentalist Protestants, who had been pro-birth control prior to that, flipped and became anti-abortion. Had they been pro-abortion prior to that, or pro-woman's right to choose, nobody's pro-abortion. You understand what I'm saying? And so, he was able to get them, and then the NRA became a force in the mid-70s. They were just a sportsman's group, very small one for that at that, but then they became basically a tool of the weapons manufacturers. They got really great funding and merged essentially with the Republican Party. And so the modern day Republican Party is basically this coalition of angry, insecure, fascistic men, white people, giant corporations and billionaires, and gun nuts. Well, the gun nuts were the men with small penises, I would say.
Would you call what the foundational philosophy that is underpinning all of this libertarian political thought?
That would be one way to describe it. I would call it fascism, frankly.
Well, I understand that, but I don't think people are, well,
the libertarians.
I don't think that the right is really willing to accept the term fascism, but I can tell you that I've got some fairly well-educated right-wingers that keep pushing all of this, anti-rioter stuff and all that kind. And what I hear underneath all of their rhetoric is this, I don't trust the government. It's we got to have more. I don't take away my guns. I mean, all of this libertarian, philosophy that was, promoted by Mr. Koch and all of those folks.
Right. Yeah, and in fact, I was looking for this book because I wanted to share this thing with you. This is when David Koch, 58 through 60 page. This is from the book, The Hidden History of the War on Voting.
Right.
But, when David Koch ran for president in 1980, or for vice president on the Libertarian, His platform was, we favor the abolition of Medicare and Medicaid. We oppose compulsory tax-supported health services. We favor the repeal of Social Security. We oppose all personal and corporate income taxes, including capital gains. We support the eventual repeal of all taxation. We support the repeal of all minimum wage laws. Government ownership, operation, regulation, and subsidy of schools and colleges should be ended. We support the abolition of the Environmental Protection Agency. We call for the privatization of all public roads in the national highway system. We advocate the abolition of the Food and Drug Administration, and we oppose all government welfare relief projects and aid to the poor programs. That has now become the Republican catechism. A lot of them won't say it out loud, but if you look at what they're actually doing,
right,
everything is fundamental to that. And its platform is privatize the post office.
Yeah, that they have created a theology basically of all of this anti-government stuff, even to the extent of, like you say, privatizing the post office and privatizing our highways.
Right, and the reason for this is that there is only one force that is strong enough to restrain a giant corporation that wants to pollute your air or poison your water or rip you off as a worker or sell you crap as a consumer. And that one force that can constrain giant corporations is called government. And right. These guys understood this. I mean, the libertarian movement started in the 70s out of a PR and marketing company that was hired by the real estate industry to deregulate real estate so that people didn't have to be honest with the people that they were selling real estate to, because they were chafing at the unnecessary regulation of having to like disclose that this house is filled with asbestos. And so their idea was, how do we make it sound like really appealing? Well, let's just say government is bad, government regulation is bad, and the opposite of government regulation is freedom. Now, Franklin Roosevelt had a very different idea, and this idea didn't, and the libertarian idea took a long time to catch on, because there were still people who remembered, and who were still alive, who remembered FDR talking about how a necessitous man is not a free man. It's a quote from his 1936 speech in Madison Square Garden, where he said, basically, if you're hungry, you're not free. If you're homeless, you're not free. If you're uneducated, you're not free. If you don't have a job, you're not free. Freedom requires a certain basic minimum. I mean, it's kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of human needs. You got to have the bottom of the pyramid before you can be thinking about freedom. But what they were trying to do was kind of blow all that to hell and replace it with this idea that freedom means that, if you want to smoke dope, cool, you can smoke dope. If you want to hire a hooker, cool, you can hire a hooker. If you want to poison your customers with asbestos or toxic chemicals, go ahead and do it, because eventually they'll figure it out and they'll stop buying your product.
Yeah, and the market will.
And that's my point. And that's why I refer to libertarians as Republicans who want to smoke dope and get laid.
Right. Yeah. Interesting. And the name of that group is was it the FFE or the FE?
The FE.
The FE. And what does that stand for again?
I don't remember. I'm sorry.
But it's in your book, and again, this is the hidden history of monopolies, how big business destroyed your American dream. It should be called, because it's beginning to have and has for the last 40 years, significant impact on a middle class America.
Which, by the way, if I could interrupt real quick, 2010 was the year that fewer than half of Americans were still in the middle class. That more than half of America had slid out of the middle class. I mean, it only took 30 years for Reaganism to destroy the American middle class. And now it's even worse. And what's the result of that? Well, when you destroy a middle class, we've seen this before in other societies. When you destroy a middle class, what happens is people get seriously pissed off. They're not sure who to be pissed off at. And if some demagogue comes along and says, oh, it's them, it's those brown people, or it's those black people, or it's those Jews, or it's, whoever that person points at, if they're sufficiently convincing, a movement will coalesce around that. And boom, pretty soon you've got concentration camps, which we have now in the United States with brown people in them, and eventually death camps.
Right. And this is the pathway to the tyranny that you're talking about,
Yes.
and the fascism of the Trump cult.
Right. That I outline in the next book, The Hidden History of Oligarchy. Yep.
Right. Right. You did listen to Michael Cohen's interview about his book when he came, when that got released on the Rachel Maddow's show.
Yeah, I saw it.
What it struck me the most was his talking about Trump as the Trump 2016 campaign was simply a marketing move for his brand.
Right.
To promote his brand.
Yep.
Which is why he's been so ill prepared to actually govern, is because this is, his brand is just simply an empty bucket with a name on it,
right,
in which you can pour anything into it, including the latest libertarian ideas, or even the most current QAnon hoaxes and conspiracy theories.
Yep.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, this is a book I recommend reading. It won't take you too long to go through it, but it's packed full of really good ideas and history that the next time you're arguing with your Republican relatives at Thanksgiving, perhaps, if you can do so in person, it would be well worth you reading. Thom, thank you very much for joining us today, and great success with this book and with the next one that's coming out when?
About 5 months, 4 or 5 months.
Okay. Well, let's all hope that and get out and vote to make sure that Mr. Trump does not get another 4 years to wreck the ship of state.
Yeah, and I look for, and let's hope that, once again, one of these days, James, you and I can sit in one of those nice little outdoor cafes down the street from your offices and have a nice lunch together. I look forward to it.
Well, the next time you can actually get out of quarantine and make it to Los Angeles, I'd be more than happy to buy you a beer down there too. Okay. Well, thank you. And again, this is Random Links News, interviewing Thom Hartmann for his new book, The Hidden History of Monopolies and How Big Business Destroyed the American Dream. And thank you all for listening today. All right. Take care.